Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, COVID-19 Crisis, What's a Strategic Public University System Board to Do? My name is Lynn Somerville and I'm the Assistant Director for AGB Consulting. I wanted to share just a few notes about the technology before we begin our conversation today. On your screen, most likely in the upper right corner, you should see GoToWebinar's control panel, and you can use this panel to interact with us throughout the webinar. You can use this panel to choose your audio option, whether you're listening through your computer, tablet, or smartphone. And if one option is not producing the sound quality that you wish, you can switch to the phone or to the computer and vice versa. Please note that due to the number of attendees on this webinar, all participants have been muted. However, we do want to hear from you throughout the broadcast, and we'll be posing your questions to the panelists as we go. To answer a question, please type it in the questions box and click send. We'll be responding to questions, like I said, throughout our conversation. So don't hesitate to use that questions box to ask your question of the panelists at any time. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. Dr. Kevin Riley is President Emeritus and Regent Professor with the 26 campus University of Wisconsin system, having served as president from 2004 to 2013. Dr. Riley also served as Chancellor and Provost and Vice Chancellor of UW Extension. A native of New York City, Dr. Riley came to Wisconsin from the State University of New York system, or SUNY system, where he was Associate Provost for Academic Programs and then Secretary for the university. Earlier in his career, he led the New York State Board of Regents office that evaluated and accredited all public, private, and for-profit colleges and universities in the state. Dr. Riley has served as the president of the National Association of System Heads, and at AGB, Kevin has led the AGB Guardians Initiative and serves as a senior fellow and senior consultant. Dr. Glenn Johnson is the Chief Executive Officer for the Oklahoma State System of Higher Education. Chancellor Johnson leads a state system comprised of 25 state colleges and universities, 11 constituent agencies, 2 university centers, and the independent colleges and universities coordinated within that state system. Johnson provides leadership on matters related to standards for Oklahoma higher ed, budget allocations, tuition, courses and programs of study, and strategic planning. Before assuming the role of Chancellor, Johnson served as the 16th president of Southeastern Oklahoma State University for 10 years. Johnson also served as Director of Public Policy and Adjunct Professor of Law at the University of Oklahoma. Prior to his work at OU, Chancellor Johnson served in the Oklahoma House of Representatives from 1982 to 1996 and was Speaker of the House from 1990 to 1996. Dr. Rebecca Martin is the Executive Director of the National Association of System Heads, an association of chief executives of the college and university systems of public higher education. NASH has worked hard to form a network of presidents, chancellors, executive directors, and commissioners, and together this group supports leaders and their peers in the unique roles they play in higher education. Dr. Martin served as Director of Higher Ed and Senior Fellow at the Education Delivery Institute from 2010 to 2015, and before joining EDI, Dr. Martin served as Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs for the University of Wisconsin system. She's also been the Provost and Vice Chancellor at the University of Wisconsin Parkside Institution and has held roles in the University of Vermont and the California State University system. I want to thank all of you for being here with us today for this conversation, and with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Riley to begin the discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Lynn, and welcome to all our participants. Great to have you here with us today. Now, let me say a word or two about how we'd like this to flow. I'll turn first to Rebecca Martin, who will talk for about 5 minutes about what NASH is learning on how system boards around the country are handling this crisis and thinking forward beyond it for what it means for the future of our systems. And then after that, I'll turn to Glenn with his introductory remarks of about 5 minutes, also giving us some sense of how on the ground in one of our systems, in Oklahoma in his case, he and his board are grappling with the immense pressures that this crisis has brought on to all of our systems and institutions. Let me say, reiterate what Lynn said, we'd like to get you involved early on as much as possible. So, and the way you're going to do that is by typing your questions in, and Lynn will kind of moderate them for us and get them on the table. And we'd like to do that as quickly as possible. So get your newly sanitized fingers on those computer keyboards and start typing as soon as you can. I have some questions that I think might help provoke conversation, and I'll be dropping those in along the way. So with that, let me turn first to Rebecca Martin and have her come on and talk a little bit about the big picture on systems and COVID-19 around the country. Rebecca?
Thank you, Kevin. So next slide, Lynn. So I think some of you are members of NASH, and so it's great to see you on this webinar, even though this is an AGB webinar. And some of you know about NASH, but in case you don't, NASH is, as Kevin mentioned or Lynn mentioned, is the Association of Chief Executives from public university systems from across the country. NASH has been around for decades, really a very strong network of like-minded people in similar roles across the country, connecting with each other about a variety of issues. And our focus in recent years has really been on leveraging the power of our systems to advance innovation and change in public higher education. Next slide. NASH is, we have 40 members in 28 states. We educate well over half of the students in public four-year institutions across the country. So while we're small in terms of the number of members that we have a very large impact in terms of the reach of the systems across the students across the country. Next slide. So we really believe in something that we call systemness, that systems can do things that campuses cannot do one at a time. Systems have the opportunity to unify actions and actors, and to leverage the influence and achieve collective impact across multiple campuses in many different ways. And that's become particularly important as we face the crisis of COVID-19. Next slide, please. So with the help of Nancy Zimpher's System Center at the University of Albany, NASH has been able to stand up a very robust set of interactions for its members. We very early on converted regular Zoom meetings, which is the way that we communicate with a number of different groups, to calls that really focused specifically on dealing with the pandemic. We do those now almost once a week. We have a listserv that's very active. We've got regular webinars on topics, and we've been doing them almost not quite once a week, but it feels like it, pretty close to that, on the role of systems in the recovery of their states, supporting remote learning, dealing with the financial implications. This week, we're going to focus on scenario planning for fall. Next week, we're looking at systems after COVID-19. So we really are trying to look at things from a wide variety of perspectives. We also have a clearinghouse of resources that we have developed to help systems share resources with one another. We have a blog series from our system leaders on how their systems are reacting. And you can find all these resources on the NASH website if you're interested. And we hope that you'll go there and take a look. I have one more slide. So here's some of just kind of overview of some things I'd say about how our systems are responding to COVID-19. Early on, of course, the big focus was on the coordination of campus transitions to remote learning, and now scenarios for planning for fall, really trying to think those things through at the campus level, at the system level, thinking about policies and practices that make sense to be common across multiple campuses, really to make things easiest for the students. We've seen greater collaboration among our campuses to meet these needs, and many of our system people as well as our campus people are saying, the system is more important now than ever, that there is really a greater need for collaboration. We're seeing less competition and protection of turf across campuses and more focus on what are the needs of the students, how can we best serve them, whether they're my students or your students, how do we marshal our resources to support them? Collective approaches to policies and practices, I've already mentioned. This is something where the board certainly can get involved, as well as the system administration. And then mobilization of resources to support communities and states. It's been really exciting to see the number of systems that are supporting Wi-Fi access, mobilizing their extension offices to support Wi-Fi access, not just for students, but for members of the community, by extending their Wi-Fi out into parking lots that now fill up with people that need access to work. They need access for K-12 schooling, as well as higher ed. We've also seen campus facilities mobilized in California in particular, but other places as well, to provide alternative medical care sites in particular communities, and testing sites. So we're really seeing a lot of the campuses and the systems really coming to the support of their broader regions and communities. I have a couple system board examples, and Kevin, I don't know if you want me to talk about them now or hold off and bring them in later, of where the boards have gotten involved in specific areas.
Why don't you give us one now, and then you can drop in the others later.
So I'll start with Colorado State University system. This is a system that I think has made a very strong case in their state about the importance of the university as a very important employment sector in the state, and recognizing and being able to back that up with data to make the case for state support with the governors. The board's gotten involved by endorsing using their resources, their reserves, and by putting into place some refinancing models to create their own initial payroll protection plan for their employees, to try to make sure that the employees are supported, and they in turn are supporting the communities, recognizing the importance of the universities in the communities where they reside. So there's one example of a specific board action that I think is making a difference.
Great, thanks much for that overview and that one example, Rebecca. Let's turn now to Glenn to talk about his experience in this very strange time with his Board of Regents in Oklahoma. Glenn?
Well, thank you, Kevin, and pleasure to be on the program with Rebecca as well. Without question, I think this COVID-19 crisis and our response from higher education's perspective to the pandemic as a nation, really this reflects an unprecedented time in the history of our country. Challenges like COVID-19 also present the opportunity to respond with exceptional discovery and innovation, and I think we have certainly done that to this point. Kevin asked me to provide the perspective from our state's constitutional coordinating board, the state regents, of which I serve as system head and chancellor, and I'll be glad to do that. We've been, I think, very aggressive in our efforts since the onset of COVID-19 in early March, and have tried to play and serve in a coordinating role in a way that addresses our responsibilities, not only as a facilitator, but also in providing very, very important information to our campuses and to our state. We've coordinated weekly conference calls similar to what Rebecca referenced earlier, where I facilitate those with our 25 college and university presidents from all three tiers, our research tier, our regional tier, and our two-year tier, where we brainstorm potential solutions. We anticipate the issues that are going to be presented to our college campuses in order to address the pandemic from higher ed's perspective. We've also developed a number of key messaging tools that have been the feedback we've received from legislators and others has been very positive. One of them is a response document that we update daily out of our office at the state regents, where we detail what we're doing in response to whether it's changes in our grading policy, whether it's decisions where there will be summer classes, and all of the issues that are emerging just in terms of how our campus is responding in a real-time basis, what the projections are going to be, in terms of whether or not campuses will be open for fall 2020, just as a couple of examples. Another resource that we've developed that has received widespread support has been a frequently asked questions document, where again, whether it deals with what we're doing on online learning, whether it covers veterans GI benefits, transitions that students are making out of the residence halls, teacher education, the impact of the CARES Act, the federal stimulus bill, and a variety of those questions that we anticipate will be coming up, not only from our campuses, from parents and students, but again, from other stakeholders, legislatures, those in the executive branch, and concerned citizens. We have, I certainly would say that probably I would list one of our major accomplishments. Literally during the 10 days, the week to 10 days of spring break, we successfully transitioned over 173,000 students in our system from the face-to-face traditional instruction they were receiving in early March to what was a fully online platform, a virtual platform, in about 10 days. Several institutions, in fact, at this point, nearly all of our institutions in Oklahoma are going to the online format for the summer. Again, as in the case, I'm sure, with all of our other states, we've either canceled or rescheduled commencements. We've already had several virtual commencements, drive-through commencements already in Oklahoma in the last week. Resident halls have been kept open for those that don't have anywhere else to stay. Otherwise, students have transitioned out of the residence halls. Cafeterias have been closed, and we've gone to what they call the grab and go concept, where students can pick up food. We've also instituted several food pantries for students. We've gone to flexible grading options for students in order to provide them flexibility. They're understanding that grading impacts degree requirements, graduation, scholarships, and a lot of other very, very important things. Every campus in our system has provided personal protection equipment to local hospitals, regional hospitals, or health clinics in their respective areas. Our two research institutions have stepped up in a major way. University of Oklahoma has provided research not only for the vaccine, but also in the area of antibody research. Oklahoma State University and the Center for Health Sciences have provided opportunities there for testing, not only as a testing site, but as a testing lab for COVID-19. And the president of OSU Health Sciences, Dr. Casey Schrum, has been really the voice for the medical community in the daily press conferences that our Governor Stitt, has conducted. We do have financial challenges, as all of our states do, having to provide to students prorated refunds for housing and meals. Certainly the costs incurred in transitioning students from face-to-face to online and a turnaround on a dime, if you will. There have been webcam purchases and other licensing purchases that have we've incurred costs there. Where the CARES Act has been very helpful, it's not covered all of our costs in any way, shape, or form. As an example, Oklahoma Higher Ed received $106 million from the CARES Act. 53 of that goes to the student, as it should. The other 53 to the institution. Just as an example, University of Oklahoma, the costs they incurred in terms of rebates for meals and housing and ramping up to provide online instruction. On day one, their costs were $12 million. The money, their share from the CARES Act for the institution, was right at $8 million. So although it was greatly appreciated, and we want to stress that, it didn't fully cover these initial costs that we've incurred. I might mention, and I know this is happening in other regions, but about 2 weeks ago, I was selected to co-chair the Southern Regional Education Board Post-Secondary Recovery Task Force in response to COVID-19. We're going to cover 4 areas in terms of providing, hopefully, best practices to the institutions in our area. The first being funding and costs, how we will continue to work to develop and to navigate the resources we need to respond to the needs of our students. The safety and health issue, how to open campuses in the fall safely, taking into mind CDC guidelines and certainly all of the other safety requirements that we need to meet. How we make distance learning, whether In some cases, it's going to be still the prominent method of education delivery in the fall, but how we make that responsive to the students. And then generally, what can we do to support students? The digital divide has certainly come up in terms of how that disproportionately impacts low-income students, underrepresented populations. And hopefully this task force will provide some information, best practices that will help us work together to navigate this environment. I would just say, Kevin, Rebecca, and Lynn, in summary, we've been very aggressive in our response in Oklahoma higher education to this point. I think from the feedback we've received, we've stepped up to the plate in a positive way. We've tried to provide leadership, direction, and serve as a resource in really an unprecedented environment that's been precipitated by COVID-19. So that concludes my comments at this time.
That's just great. Thank you, Glenn. And you put your finger on two related themes that maybe we want to take up as we have the conversation with our colleagues. But one is the new level of communications that system leaders need to have with not only their boards, but a whole range of stakeholders out there at this time. And then being sure to communicate too about the value of university research in helping move the country beyond the worst of this pandemic. And that piece of communication, I think, should be followed up on throughout, so we come out of this with people better recognizing perhaps what a vital role our research plays in what is a core challenge to the society. So thanks. Let me see from Lynn if we have any questions from participants yet, and if not, I can kick off with some questions of my own. But Lynn, any questions coming in from our colleagues?
No questions have come in yet, so why don't you kick off with a question? And again, we encourage participants to write in anything that you're curious about, receiving perspective from Rebecca and Glenn and Kevin on. So check in with me later, Kevin, but take it away for now.
Good. All right. Well, let me start with one to Glenn, and he mentioned the whole issue of whether to open or not to open. And let me put the question to you this way, Glenn. So as boards, system boards consider this question, whether to reopen for the fall semester.
Kevin, we may be having a little difficulty. Could you restate the question? Kevin. Lynn, can you hear me?
Yes, it looks like Kevin might be experiencing.
What I was saying was, as boards
go ahead.
consider whether to reopen in the fall or not. System. All right, let's see. Can you hear me now, Glenn?
Well, yeah, why don't you restate it? I think you're back on.
All right. So the question is, as boards consider whether to reopen institutions in their system in the fall, what does a sound decision-making process look like to get to a defensible decision about whether to do that or not? And I was saying, I think any decision that's made, we know will need to be defensible because it will come under attack one way or the other. And maybe a sub question to that is, how should system boards also now look forward to grapple with contingency plans in the event that they do open and there's a second wave of the virus?
Okay, well, I think, again, the question to reopen or not has been prominent for the last several weeks now, and certainly in our state, and I know in other states on some of the boards where I serve, where this is our topic of discussion. Kevin, I think I would say a couple of things, again, focusing on Oklahoma. 2 weeks ago now, our two flagship research institutions, the University of Oklahoma in Norman, Oklahoma State University in Stillwater, and Tulsa and Oklahoma City, both made the decision to reopen in the fall. The criteria that they utilized involved a variety of checkpoints. Certainly, making sure that every step of the way as they transition, and again, understanding if you're going to be opening the campus, and when I say opening, that would mean offering classes, certainly some in the virtual format, but also the effort to offer classes face-to-face, and the decision to reopen campus housing, residence halls, and certainly cafeterias. First and foremost, adherence to all of the CDC guidelines. But I also think that it became very clear, and again, this is not a decision I think I need to say, and from our standpoint, we're the coordinating board, so we don't make the final call, but we're very involved in the discussion, and again, in our role as a facilitator of the discussion and as a resource to providing information. Certainly, looking at adhering to all the guidelines, I think I would say that in every discussion, the safety and security of students, and not just students for that matter, but faculty, staff, and other visitors on campus has been paramount in all the discussions, as it should be. But I think it also is going to require all of us, Kevin, to look down and really get very granular and get into the weeds, if you will, on what reopening means. In all likelihood, it's going to mean most, if not all, of these things. Again, given where we are in response to COVID-19 when we get to late August, it may require temperature checks when you enter and exit residence halls, cafeterias, for that matter, our classrooms and our classroom buildings. It may certainly require ongoing monitoring and testing at some level, and whether or not the responsibility to wear masks is on the individual or whether the institution takes on that responsibility as well. All of those types of issues are being were looked at and are continuing to be reviewed and looked at as they transition to an opening of August and September. And I think there's a recognition that this is not something you can set in place and then walk away. There's going to have to be constant monitoring, review, revision, just as, you know, it's been said, and we've heard it, that the crisis, the COVID-19 does not have a calendar or a timetable. And so we're making these decisions now based on the best information that we have at the college and university level, but recognizing that there could be something, we hope it doesn't happen, but to be prepared, recognizing there could be events between now and August that may require a backup plan. And so as institutions are going forward, and some have made the decision in Oklahoma to reopen for the fall, we have a number at our regional university level and two-year level that even though they are having summer classes completely online, they're making the decision within this week or so as to whether or not they'll be open for the fall semester. And as they review all of that, I think they are also recognizing they need to have that backup plan or that contingency plan in the event that something changes. Then what are their options going to be? I can tell you the resolve and the commitment is there is a very, very strong feeling that we need to continue the learning opportunity for our students. In the spring and this summer, we've transitioned well to the online format. Some students are fine with that. There's others that are already making it clear they would prefer the face-to-face format. They would prefer what we call the traditional campus environment. And so we have to take that into account, but also, again, the primary concern is to construct the main plan and the backup plan where as we're making these decisions, the safety and security of our students, our faculty, our staff, and our visitors on campus are protected to the greatest extent that we can. And I think that's the commitment. Those are the issues we're continuing to work through and wrestle with, if you will, as we continue to make decisions in an effort to be ready for classes in the fall.
Great, thanks, Glenn. And I'll come to you, Rebecca, for a comment on that one, and then I have another question. Let me just say that as I listen to you talk, you know, the level of variables that impinge on all of these decisions is so great. And I saw a quote from Ted Mitchell at ACE the other day where he was talking about the situation we're in. Boards and leaders find themselves is something like playing three-dimensional chess while riding a surfboard in a tsunami.
Yeah.
Caught my attention. I think there's some truth
Yeah.
to that.
So
Well,
one thing I wanted to add to Glenn's comments, you hit all the high points, Glenn, but there's one point that has come up multiple times in the discussions among NASH leaders, which is, you know, maybe we shouldn't be talking about reopening our campuses because we've never been closed. Unlike a lot of other industries and workplaces around the country, we didn't close. We transitioned. We're doing learning in a different way. We're doing teaching in a different way, but we're still doing it. And so, sorry, this is not COVID cough, it's allergies. And so what we need to be doing is talking about returning students to the physical campus. To do otherwise, I think, really undermines our position about the strength of the offerings that we've been able to do in a remote environment. I also wanted to say that, you know, there are a lot of nuances here. We could return to the physical campus. We could bring students and faculty back, and we need to talk about their safety. But we also need to recognize that some of them may not be comfortable coming back, that there's a vulnerability there for some students and some faculty members. So we need to be able to provide alternative ways for them to continue to participate and contribute. And you know, there's a lot of variability. The scenario planning, I think, goes beyond, well, we bring people in and then maybe they have to leave. It's how do we plan ahead of time for some of that might occur? Can we go to modular scheduling so that we plan for maybe we have just a month on campus and then we have a month when we're going to be in remote setting again. So we have to be a lot more agile, a lot more nimble than we're used to being. And that kind of scenario planning, and rather than strategic planning, which we're all very familiar with, really requires a lot more adaptability.
Good. Thank you, Rebecca. And you know, when you're talking about returning students, an interesting variable here, right, is that some students may return, but they may decide they want to return to a campus that's closer to home than the one they had been enrolled at before. That's a whole other level of mystery that we're trying to sort our way through here now, and it's not an easy one.
And Kevin, I might just add one thing to that discussion. Again, at least our perspective in Oklahoma, when the concept of reopening is there, and looking at where we are now in terms of what the differences in the fall. Right now, there's no face-to-face instruction, and the residence halls are closed. So at least in Oklahoma, reopening contemplates continuing the option for online, but also there being an option of face-to-face instruction for those students that want that opportunity, and the residence halls and cafeterias, which are currently closed, that those would be reopened.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And maybe in some instances, right, using more online instruction, even for students who are on campus,
Right.
but you don't want to send into a 300 student introductory lecture. Well, Rebecca, let me move on with a question for you. One of the things that's clear is that this crisis has brought into sharp relief issues of equity all across the country, where our poorer and more disadvantaged Americans are much more at risk in terms of both health and financial interests. So in our universities, we have students and employees from those groups, those families, and they're often the ones who are struggling hardest right now to keep on track. What can system boards do to help carry the torch for those students and employees as they struggle through this time?
Well, I think they need to, first of all, recognize that these issues have been there for a long time. And I think that this crisis has brought them into focus, into much sharper relief now that we see them much more clearly. But, you know, we need to recognize that sending students home to do their classes from a remote location means for some students, they don't have a home to go to. They're sitting in their cars. They don't have a good home base to return to. They don't have the digital divide that Glenn was mentioning a minute ago is a very real issue. There are issues of food security that have been on our campuses for a long time, but we haven't seen them as clearly, I think, as we see them now. So I think the first thing board members need to do is ask the questions. Be ready to be there and ask about what's going on. What services are we providing? How are we addressing the needs of these students? How are we finding what they need? And then asking the questions about where the resources come from to begin to try to address those needs. But I think that we should recognize that these are not new issues, but we're in a point in time in our society when I think we're seeing them a lot more clearly, and that carries into the university setting as well.
Kevin, I would just add to that, Rebecca's nailed it in terms of the board needing to look at an issue that's been out there for a while, but this COVID-19 crisis has prompted action and response. I think the board's approaching it from the standpoint of what can we do to help students continue their college education, whether that be assistance and everything from tablets to course materials to helping them with food opportunities. I mentioned several of our institutions have gone to food pantries in our state in an effort to address that, and even issues like childcare, if they're going to be during the time period they're engaged in their coursework, where help can be provided to them in that way. The board really, again, if the focus will be how can we help them continue their education, I think that would be an appropriate issues for boards to concern themselves with.
Very good. Well, it's certainly my hope that as we come out of this at our universities and in the wider society, we'll recognize better that some of the folks in these groups are the people who've been keeping us alive during this pandemic, and that the attitude of the society will change a bit to their role in it. So maybe that'll be a good outcome after all the trouble. Let me turn now to Lynn again and see if we've got any questions from or comments or reactions from participants. Lynn, any questions or other comments you're getting?
Thanks, Kevin. We do have a few questions, so thank you for sending those in. Several of them really center around the cadence of communication between a system leader and their board, how that's changed in the midst of this crisis, things that institutional leaders should think about, what decisions board members need to be made aware of and when, and just thoughts generally about how communication between boards and leaders have changed in light of COVID.
Yep. Central question. So who wants to take a shot at that first?
I will.
Okay.
So there we have examples in quite a number of our systems, and this may be true for you too as well, Glenn, where the board has actually delegated greater responsibilities to the system leader during this period of time. And what every one of those system leaders says when they tell me that is, and that means I need to communicate even more with the board than I already do, that I'm not going to go out. I've said, yes, I'll take that responsibility. I appreciate the flexibility, and I'm not going to really move without making sure that you all know what's going on. And so that communication, I think, is really very important. There are a number of system leaders that have taken the opportunity of the crisis to set up regular communications with board members, much as Glenn was talking about doing with all of his presidents, where in Maryland, I know the system leader once a week does a call with the board. And of course, we have open meeting laws, so these are board meetings, so people can dial in. They're seeing better attendance at these open meetings than they've ever seen. And what they're finding out is that this has become a really important communications vehicle to get the good news of what the system is doing, the institutions are doing to contribute to the community out to a broader audience. Reporters are showing up and writing stories based on that. And so I think that there's most of those regular check-in calls are just that. They're updates. This is what's going on. This is what we need to be thinking about. And then teeing up the really important questions for more of a traditional kind of board setting for decision making?
I would say, again, I think, again, Rebecca has touched on a number of key points. You really have, we've had to look at this in three phases. Initially, what you might call a triage phase, where a lot of decisions need to be made quickly, which of course requires the CEO to be in a position of anticipating and recommending. Even with that, I've tried to make an effort, particularly with our board chair, to stay in rather frequent communications. We have weekly calls that we've always conducted. Those have ramped up to where they're at least 2 times a week. We dealt with the emergency phase, then I think a stabilization phase where we now are at a point where we're assessing all of the issues and assessing the way we need to be responding. Finally, as we move further, there will be a transformation phase where it gives us time to look at the long-term impacts. But with all of that being said, I think the communication with the board is critical. There is always that fine line between, when do you call them on what may be an operational issue. I've always found it's better not to surprise them. They are very interested in wanting to work through from the boundaries of their governance role to the operational role. I think, at least in our case, we've achieved a really good balance there. And generally speaking, for these decisions to be navigated, I think the input of the board, again, these are the leaders in our state. They've been successful in business. They've been successful in other endeavors, and to leverage them as we're working through this and to utilize their expertise and the assets they bring to the table is really important. So I tend to think that communication should be frequent, and it should be where they are informed on everything that's going on, and they're consulted every time it's appropriate to do that.
Yeah, I think as our students and their families are worried about issues of their health, of life and death in some instances, as students and families are worried about, are we getting the quality of the education that we signed up for and that we're paying for? Board members will come under much more pressure, heavier and more frequent pressure from the general public that they deal with to be able to answer those questions. So I think for chancellors, presidents, executive directors, thinking a little bit about how you deploy your senior team of colleagues, including the board secretary, senior VPs, in working with members of your board. I mean, typically, some of those folks are going to have great relations with particular members on the board because they work with them. They staff the academic affairs committee. They staff the finance committee. How can you deploy that team just to be out there talking on a regular basis, informally, one-on-one with board members is one way to handle this need for a lot more regular communication. And I think keeping board members feeling that they can talk when they're asked about how you all are handling this crisis. They can talk in an informed, positive way about that with the people who, again, more and more are going to be asking them those questions. Lynn, any other questions from our audience?
Yes, we have a question about assembling a crisis team and the team that system heads have around them to help work through this in a system made up of multiple institutions, maybe hospitals as well. What advice do you have for system heads as to who needs to be in the room to help make those decisions?
Good question. Glenn or Rebecca, you want to kick that one?
Well, I think, again, I think it's important that we stay in our lane, but by the same token, we are ready to be helpful towards the broader crisis. In our case in Oklahoma, we formed groups with our regents and with our presidents that also involve our senior officers at the state regents system head office. And we have our communications, again, where we meet at least bi-weekly. But as we venture into that broader realm, our governor has been very aggressive in Oklahoma about responding and coordinating, and we've also had quite a bit of communication with cabinet secretaries in the Health and Human Service area, coordinating when and if there may be space that may need to be offered to healthcare workers. We've worked and coordinated an effort to marshal PPE equipment and resources, and then coordinating those to where they've been delivered to area and regional hospitals and healthcare clinics. We have daily and regular communications with the Governor's Secretary of Education as we begin to navigate through money coming from the federal stimulus bill, specifically some of those funds that are in the governor's discretionary funds. And so I think through, at least from our perspective in Oklahoma, through the governor's cabinet apparatus and the way we have worked and leveraged that opportunity, we have a number of areas where they know if they need assistance from higher education, we're there to respond immediately. We're there to be available to help. From the same standpoint, we're working through our issues, and we have communications with them where when we need assistance, like clarification on funding or something of that nature, we've had, and I might say the legislature has also been extremely responsive in our state as we have a rather unique situation. In addition to the funding problems created by COVID-19, we're a oil and gas state, and you've probably seen that that's been fairly volatile the last 2 months, and so we've really had to wrestle with dual financial hurdles at the same time. Our legislature has been very not only helpful and supportive, but crafted looks like the budget that will be the budget that they've sent to the governor for consideration, where in the case of both common education and higher education, they structured a budget that could not completely shield us for budget reductions next year, but certainly differentiated between education and other areas, which we've greatly appreciated. So I think it goes back to the communications and being able to wire in with the team and in one way be helpful, but also have access to that information when we need the information our way, coming back to higher education to make those critical decisions.
Yeah, I think
Thanks.
Glenn's got all the right players. I guess the only group I would mention is needing to be very closely wired in as well are the campus presidents. I mean, I think that that's the leadership team that's going to put the plans into action, and they need to be actively involved as well. And so, you know, with the system, there's always the push and pull between what's the system level, what's the campus level. You really need to figure out how to pull those together at this stage.
Well said. Lynn, any other questions from participants?
Yes, we have had a question, a more specific one about, I know we've talked about it a little bit, but what the thinking is in systems across the country about the timing of letting first-year residential students know regarding the final decision about opening or not opening, just to maximize their level of comfort. And so any perspective from the national landscape, I think, would be helpful for this participant.
Well, I think that I don't have a clear answer. I guess I think that people are kind of thinking June is a period of time when we need to be able to start sending clear signals about what we're planning. But as Glenn indicated earlier, there are a lot of criteria, a lot of different things in play that are going to happen in July and August that might change those perspectives. And so I think that while we are seeing systems saying, oh, here's our plan and this is our intention, they're framing it that way. This is not a guarantee, because we don't know what's going to happen with the virus specifically. And I think they're pointing to indicators, much as we've seen the guidelines for the states. These are the kinds of things that we need to see in place if we're going to move forward, and it's our intention to do that. But the making an ironclad commitment to first-year students is not something I think people are feeling they're in a position to do at this point. Unless you have a magic way to do that in Oklahoma, Glenn.
And we don't. I think that's well said, and it's clear in our state there's no cookie cutter approach to this. The two research institutions, University of Oklahoma and Oklahoma State University, have already announced their plans, but and their plans are to reopen for fall 2020, with that being both face-to-face instructions and the reopening of residence halls. But I think it's clear in our discussion with the president, the presidents in our system, everybody's not there yet. And what that means is, as is the case in every other state, there's a variety of variables, and those variables are different institution from institution. And what I'm seeing is that each institution is carefully evaluating those options and those variables. I would say, you know, as you say, Rebecca, June may be it may be that's going to be the time where, if a decision is going to be made to reopen, it should be made at some point in that time frame, simply to give students the notice they're going to need to be ready. But I'm seeing that each institution is evaluating their options, working with their senior teams, working with their board, and evaluating all this in terms of how that works for them. And frankly, that's the way it should be done.
I guess the only other thing I would add is that in the systems, they're more likely to be making coordinated decisions at the system level for multiple campuses. That's not the case everywhere. There are some places where the campuses are so widely dispersed, the communities are very different, and they will see variation across the system. But for the most part, systems are working with their boards to try to come to a common position for the systems campuses.
Good. I'm going to interject here a question that one never likes to ask, but I think we need to. But before I do that, let me say that Rebecca will need to leave a little early because she's got to facilitate a webinar in the next hour. So let me ask this one, though. This is the tough one. So with all the immense pressure that's coming on to university system budgets, from predicted lost enrollments, predicted or begun state budget cuts, shrinking endowments, hampered fundraising, refunded room and board charges, possible reductions in tuition for online courses and maybe other courses. With all of that, how would you advise system board members to think about the issue of campus closures? I think campus consolidations, at least, or closures, talk about that within systems is inevitable, and indeed it's already started in some systems. How would you advise system board members to take up those considerations if they feel they need to, other than I know, knowing both of you, you would have both advised them to do that very carefully, given the fraught topic.
Let me start, since I'm going to have to get off in just a couple minutes here. So I guess the most important thing is to stay true to the mission. Really think about the mission of the university system, what it needs to achieve for the state, and how best to achieve it. We know that coming out of this crisis, higher education is not going to look like it did before we went into it. And what we've got to figure out is how to be able to remain true to the core mission of our institutions, to make sure that we are continuing to deliver the education that our states need, that our students need. And that's going to be making some hard decisions, not just about mergers and institutions, but programs and a whole array of things about what it is we're doing. And I think it's about trying to figure out what's most important. And I'm going to have to, with that, sign off. So thank you all very much. I appreciated your questions. I always appreciate talking with Glenn and Kevin. I always learn so much from both of you. So thank you. And please, all of you, take care, stay safe, be well, and we'll see you on the next round.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you.
Glenn, you want to take that question up?
I will. I think, again, tough issue, but one that clearly I think as systems we need to be coming to grips with. Clearly, our college and universities are under a lot of pressure to change business models. We've seen the projections that our enrollment this fall may be declining rather significantly. And in many states, including ours in Oklahoma, there will be reductions programmed for state appropriations next year. Again, that brings to mind efficiencies, and when that comes up, one of the items that goes along with that is recommendations with regard to closures, consolidation, or mergers. Just a couple of thoughts, and again, some of this, Kevin, and our listeners today is what we have done to this point in Oklahoma. We put together 2.5 years ago a task force on the future of Oklahoma to take, or higher education in Oklahoma, to really take a deep dive into all of these issues, not just everything from degree completion to online to system structure to efficiencies. And one of the recommendations came out of that was to conduct, prior to any decisions on mergers or closures, fiscal and financial viability review, which does again a baseline approach on all of the variables that go into the financial status and the financial health, if you will, of the institution. We've done that now over the last year in our state, and again, we think that's important as institutions. We made recommendations in Oklahoma 2 years ago about merging several of our institutions, and we think it's appropriate to have the financial data, the baseline data, where institutions that may be interested in merging, and our first phase is to look at voluntary mergers, but where both the institution that may be interested in bringing another college or university into their board structure has the most recent baseline financial data. On the flip side, it's important that the institution that may be considering the merger from the standpoint of being merged also has that same data. A lot of factors into this. Legislatively, I think the initial reaction is normally, college and universities represent they're major employers. In legislators' districts, there's certainly a financial impact that needs to be considered. And the other thing is just the time period on how this is done and what you need to do. I think we found to this point the effort to look at that on a voluntary basis first has yielded some good results, where initially we're looking at how it will be beneficial, with the idea that enhancing the academic product and student outcomes should be paramount. Even provisions where if institutions merge, that the dollars saved through administrative costs would be used and plowed back into the academic enterprise for those reasons. The only other thing I would say is if you are looking at this, I think it's important, as much as you can, realizing it's difficult, to try to, once you have a plan in your state, to try to get buy-in from some of the stakeholders. Just sitting down and saying, okay, here are the numbers. While we'd all like to have business as usual from now on, budget concerns, COVID-19, the need to achieve and leverage all the efficiencies we can, and frankly, to be good stewards of taxpayers' dollars, may drive us to look at some of these new options. And let's, as much as we can, sit down and look at how holistically this will be beneficial for higher ed and our students as we go forward. Now, again, that's easier said than done, but I think if there's a way to have that conversation on the front end, and then the only other thing I would say, at least in our case, initiating discussions where those mergers initially are voluntary, makes sense, because there's not as much of an opportunity to draw a firm line in the sand, which then it's often more difficult to go to the next step. Those would be my thoughts. It's a tough issue, but I think in this environment, it's an issue that we have to be discussing in higher education as we go forward.
Part of what I hear you and Rebecca saying is, with your board, try to get out in front of this in terms of having you and the board set the terms for the discussion in advance and hook that discussion to your basic principles of service to the state and its citizens throughout the discussion. But it's always a murderously tough discussion, but I think more of our colleagues are going to have it.
And it's helpful to have current financials before you start the discussion.
Absolutely. Absolutely necessary. All right. Well, Lynn, do we have time for one more from the participants, or are we about out of time?
I think we are about out of time. So I just want to thank you, Kevin, and you, Glenn, for participating in this webinar and for your excellent insights. Kevin, thanks for moderating, and Glenn, thank you for bringing what's working for you in Oklahoma, as well as what you've learned through your extensive experience. So it's been a great conversation, and I'm sure that participants found it valuable. Before we sign off today, I just wanted to point our participants to a few additional resources that AGB provides. As you heard from Rebecca earlier, NASH also offers support for system heads across the country, and I encourage you to take advantage of those offerings as well. AGB has a dedicated page on our website for resources related to COVID-19. If you are interested in assistance or having a thought partner help you think through any governance challenges or strengthen the business strategy of your system, I encourage you to check out the link to AGB Consulting Services. And then you'll also see on the screen our upcoming webinars for the rest of this week. Again, thank you to Kevin and Glenn and Rebecca. And as a reminder, you'll receive a recording of this conversation as well as the PowerPoint slides within 48 hours. For any additional questions that you might have, please reach out to me at the email and phone number on the screen, and I can make sure that our panelists receive those questions and are able to respond. Again, thank you to all who joined us today, and we hope to see you at upcoming webinars. And Glenn and Kevin, thank you for participating today as well.
Thanks,
Thank
Lynn.
you, Lynn.
Thanks, Glenn.
Kevin, pleasure to be with you.
Same here. Good luck. Be well.
Have a good afternoon.
Thank you.